welcome to the second lecture on the ethics module for EDN 3200. I hope you enjoyed the first section and found it stimulating and thought-provoking. Now that we've got a few different words to talk about ethics and how it has been framed in the past, let's spend some time thinking about how ethics relates to groups of people and not just individuals. Here we get into the territory of sociology, where section 1 was more looking at moral philosophy, although the two overlap in many ways when we apply questions regarding normative issues at the scale of society. The relevance of social aspects of ethics to education are pretty self-explanatory. When we become teachers, we are not just making everyday decisions about how to be good to and do good for our students. We are participating in the process of social reproduction or social change. Education as a social practice is about the transmission of knowledge, often intergenerationally, so that those who come after can learn from and build on the knowledge developed by those who went before. In isiXhosa, we would say, "Inyathi zibuzelwa phambili." We want those who come after to utilize the knowledge they get and fully participate in society in multiple ways. Now, schools are the most widely spread and common form of institutionalized education. And outside of the family, schools are where most children of the world spend a large amount of their childhood time. So it follows that the work of educating and of being an educational and ethical teacher has a significant impact on what types of values and knowledges persist in broader society. If we're going to appreciate the complexity of this, we need to understand how we are positioned in the broader flows and contours of social power. In this section, we're going to look at the following key questions. How do we relate our everyday individual lived experience to broader social threads and contours? To look at this, we're going to use two concepts: the sociological imagination by C. Wright Mills, and also historical awareness. We're going to think about how do individuals' ideals of what is good and what is right relate to group concepts such as society, politics, and justice. And finally, we're going to use the terms monism and pluralism to think about the limitations of rationality for ethical problems. Just a reminder that there was a task in preparation for this section where you went onto the Ruler Forum and offered your own thoughts around three terms: society, politics, and justice. If you haven't yet done this task, please pause this video now and head off to the Ruler Forum to have a look at others' definitions and to offer your own thoughts. The sociological imagination. Sociological imagination is a term coined by C. Wright Mills in a book by the same title. And it refers to the idea of connecting your personal biography or story or life history with social history. For example, how do my experiences as an individual relate to broader trends, patterns, flows, and structures of society at different levels? Let's think through a scenario. A newly qualified teacher is struggling to find a job. Now, this could be a personal problem if, say, she is being very particular about the type of school that she's willing to apply to. But her struggle could also be a social issue if education budgets have been cut and there are no new posts for newly qualified teachers, because there's austerity economics that means that schools are not hiring. It could be a blend of both if she's, for example, qualified in a niche subject such as music. Her struggle then is a blend of her own particular narrow focus, but also a function of the undervaluing of the arts in public schools in general. Most problems are like the last scenario. They're a sticky mix of both personal preferences and choices and broader structural issues. We will struggle to understand other people's ideas of what is right or good if we cannot see how their experience of the world is different to ours. And the details in the differences between our experiences are often down to chance or personal choices. But there are also regularities and patterns in those experiences, depending where in society we got thrown in when we were born. Most common factors that shape our experience of the world would include our gender, our sexuality, our racial presentation, our ethnicity, the language we learned from our childhood caregivers, the economic circumstances of our childhood caregivers, whether we have bodies that function or appear in a way that society deems normal, where we were born and where we grew up, our religious affiliations, etc. And although there are more factors, these are some of the most common ones that shape our life chances and experiences in predictable ways, and therefore necessarily are going to influence how we understand ethics, what we think is right or good or just. Now, unsurprisingly, those of us who share particular experiences tend to often share similar ethical perspectives, although that's not always the case. So ethics is often influenced by experience, but it's not determined by it. Now, this is a very strong argument for ethics as a contingent function of social relations. More than ever, right now, we're having conversations about social injustice. And these are continuing to animate people's ideas about what is ethical, good, and right. So, for example, in times gone by, thinking about women, thinking about Black people, thinking about the differently abled, of queer or intersex people, of people of the Jewish or Muslim faiths, or other marginalized religions, of the poor, thinking about these people as not people was perfectly okay. In some cases, those who belonged to these groups were not thought of participating in society at all. For example, the ancient Greek moral philosophers may have reasoned about what was right or good in their society, but they did not define society as including slaves, women, or foreigners. As you will read in the Christie paper before the next section, this doesn't mean that we should ignore all their ideas, but rather that we have to read them in context and recognize the limitations of them when we apply them to the present day. Now, unfortunately, most of these forms of inequality haven't left us, but we are more conscientious of them than ever before. So what would have passed as acceptable or ethical behavior in the past is no longer the case. And this is a really strong argument in favor of the idea from section 1 that ethics are socially contingent. For example, domestic battery was once legal. Now it's a criminal offense. Racist behavior was once considered normal and natural. And now in general, it is not, although it is not widely enough condemned. But unfortunately, these past historical inequities, where ideas about what was good or right were different to what they are now, those inequities have continued into the present moment. And so we need another type of imagination if we're going to think about ethical issues in nuanced and informed ways. I've called this historical awareness. So we need to not only be able to understand relations of our current personal problems and larger social issues, but we also need to understand how what exists in the present day was shaped by past events and issues. In the words of John Berger, history refuses to shut its mouth. The time that was ticks inside the time that is. So we can't begin to understand how people hold the views they do and how we can live well together if we do not understand where other people's perspectives come from and their origins. We're going to look at this a little bit more when we look at monism versus pluralism at the end of this section, and also in section 3 when we look at the idea of the ethical imagination. Now, how we define society, how we understand politics as the state of relations of power in groups, and how we understand justice necessarily relates to how we think about ethics at scale and in groups. Let's have a look at the 3 terms that we looked at on the Ruler Forum prior to this section. We could do whole undergraduate degrees on these 3 terms, and maybe some of you already have. But let's think about them in relation to the issues we raised in section 1 about ethics and how it involves normative judgments about what is good or better, and how these ideas of good or better are shaped by when, where, and how we're thrown into the world. Let's take the term society, for example. It has come to have an increasingly complex meaning. So in pre-modern times, it might have involved one's local village. It might have just been a town or a city-state. But in modern times, it's usually come to refer to a nation-state, which is the unit of social organization or political organization, what we call a country. But the last 30 years have seen an explosion of globalization, and the idea of society has increasingly taken on transnational and planetary scales of meaning. I really recommend the work of Nancy Fraser if you're interested in this more. So now what we think about as good or right for society or the collective takes into consideration far larger scales of influence than ever before. An excellent example of this is climate change and how the actions of people on one side of the globe affect the livelihoods and health of the people on the other. Now, it's actually questionable whether the idea of ethics could even exist outside of social relations. I mean, what does it mean to be good if you're alone on a desert island? There's something to ponder the next time you're in the shower. But look at the definitions on the ruler folder for each of these terms that I've sourced from the Blackwell Dictionary of Sociology, and see how those definitions relate to your own initial conceptions and the conceptions of your classmates in the discussion forum. What throws up ethical complexity is when we understand that the practice of ethics, i.e. making these normative decisions, relates with complexity to the society in which one lives, the contours and contestations about power in that society at different layers, that is politics, little p, not politics, big P, party politics, but politics, the relations of power in social relationships together and representation and decision making. And then also our notions about what is just plays out against both the current moment and historical context. Let's look at some examples of ethical complexities that have played out in recent times. The first one involved the riots that erupted in the United States following the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minnesota police officers in 2020. Now, this set off ripples of action calling for change in how systematic law enforcement continues to punish some racial groups disproportionately as compared to others. And it's impossible to understand this rage and why people have taken to the streets if you don't understand how Black people are socially positioned in the US, where they have not had access to equal opportunities for economic, cultural, and social upliftment, and this is still the case. And you also need to understand the history of Black people in the United States, first as slaves, then as second-class citizens, denied access to schooling, housing, employment, in a manner that's quite similar actually to apartheid South Africa, although not necessarily recognized as such. Now, there are a lot of ongoing debates, which are not new topics, about the morality of rioting or whether violence can be condoned as a reasonable response to violence. That's an old conversation that we're not going to resolve anytime soon. But it's not clear what the answer is, given, for example, the longevity of the discrimination Black people have endured in the US and how more pacifist efforts to bring about change have failed. Does this mean that there is perhaps an argument, a justification for getting a bit more forceful? To quote Martin Luther King, a riot is the language of the unheard. Let's think through another example of ethical complexity closer to home. In 2020, teachers across the country were thrown into ethical dilemmas regarding the reopening of schools during the COVID pandemic. And we'll talk about this more in section 7 on ethics education and pandemic later. But suffice to say now that there were a lot of different perspectives about what was the right thing to do at the time. And these were often delineated by socioeconomic status. A sociological imagination asks us to think about how a teacher understands her conditions and the difficulties at her school, with her class and her students, and to relate this to the broader picture in particular ways. Let's think through 3 different scenarios. In the first scenario, we're thinking of a teacher who works out in Koffenbaba, who drives 60 kilometers to a village school every day in a crammed taxi with 10 other teachers. Her school has only about 30 children in each class, but there's no running water, and they only have long drop pit toilets. She's got about 1 textbook for every 5 students. Now, what is she thinking when she thinks about how she's going to protect herself and her students from a pandemic? In scenario number 2, we're thinking of a teacher who teaches in Etwatwa in East Gauteng. Now, she walks to school because she lives in the local community, but her school is over 2,000 children, and there's up to 75 children in a class. There are very few working taps at the school, 1 in the staff room, maybe 1 tap per toilet block, but most of the toilets are very broken and run down, and hundreds of children are sharing a single toilet. She's got about 1 textbook for every 4 students. And her school offers 6 first additional languages, so there's a lot of linguistic diversity, which means that students are moving around a lot in order to get all the subjects they need to fill their curriculum timetable. In our third scenario, we're going to think of a teacher in Rondebosch in Cape Town. She drives to school in her own car. Her classes are about 28 children each, and all the staff and student bathrooms are clean and functional. The school has a good fee collection rate, and so they can afford to buy hand sanitizer dispensers for the doorways of each room and to keep them fully stocked at all times. Each teacher might have some historical awareness as to how her school got to the position it's in. The negotiated settlements of the mid-1990s meant that some schools benefited from the transition of power, but others didn't. Urbanization movements have meant that rural schools have started to empty out as families have moved to the cities in pursuit of employment, but also that poor urban schools have become overcrowded as a result. She might also have a sense of how decisions of a different type are made at different layers of government between the national government, the province, and her school's governing body. And so how schools exercise autonomy or even express their voices differs across contexts. Now, all of these might feed into a teacher's mind, and she's putting on her slippers at 6 a.m. in the morning. She's going to make herself a cup of coffee, and she's going to decide if she's going to go to school or if she's going to heed the call to stay away. These are all ethical considerations, pitching the interests of her students and her family and her community, and if her employer threatens her with disciplinary action, perhaps her own interests, against the interests of broader society. So this poor teacher is pondering all these things and she's facing a lot of dilemmas and contradictions. What will shape her choice in the end will include her sense of what society is and how she fits into it, her beliefs about politics and how decisions are made and who gets to decide, and her sense about what is just or right when weighing up all these contradictory forces. She will face trade-offs between individual and collective interests. She will need to reconcile long-term and short-term ideas of good and right regarding immediate threats to health and safety versus long-term threats to education. She will need to think through whether she's making her decision based on a principle or whether she's trying to achieve a particular outcome. And she will have to engage with whether there are for her just some non-negotiables that are not up for contestation or consideration. All of this in the light and the shadow of her own sociological imagination and historical awareness. Considering all these complexities and their effect on how we can know what is right or good in a given situation has probably got you wondering, is there a way through? Can we find a universal ideal to aspire to when there is so much contingency and complexity? This leads us to the last idea in this section, monism versus pluralism. This is often attributed to the work of Isaiah Berlin. Monism refers to the idea that there is only one way of being reasonable, and that if you apply reason and rationality correctly, all paths to reason will converge to a single conclusion. Now, this is very much the rationalist perspective that we inherited from the Enlightenment in the West. But pluralism, on the other hand, acknowledges that reason can be used by different people with different positions and perspectives, and they will arrive at different conclusions which are equally valid. No one is being irrational or illogical, but rather they are functioning from different premises. So our three teachers from our three different scenarios could all make very reasonable and rational arguments for what they decide, and yet come to totally different conclusions about what to do and what is good. This is not a descent into relativism. Rather, it's calling for us to embrace the complexity of human ethics in action and to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway puts it, rather than to eschew or avoid complexity because it is difficult. I think that pluralism offers more promise for the task of living together well. I would argue that education is not just about enabling our students to live well as individuals, but to enable them to live well together. And that's extremely hard, especially given at the moment that many are asking whether we can tolerate each other at all. Now, that's really understandable given how many feel that living across deep inequalities of class, race, gender, ethnicity in South Africa is just too painful and difficult. But I think that historical awareness would make us think about projects that have tried to not live together. And that unfortunately, these projects of trying to avoid living together have produced some of the greatest atrocities that humans have ever known. Apartheid, the Holocaust, Jim Crow, Rwandan genocide, the situation in Palestine are all examples where people don't want to live together, or a dominant group does not wish to live with another group of people. So living together well is probably what we need to strive for. That's an ethical project and an educational project. It is normative and it seeks a sense of what is good. We will explore this more together in section 3 when we look at the concept of the ethical imagination for education. But living together well is far more likely if we can appreciate that pluralism is the situation we have to work with. this section, we've looked at how our everyday lived experience and ethical situations relate to broader social contours of difference and power, the ideas of sociological imagination and historical awareness, and how these inform our ethics. Finally, we looked at the idea of monism and pluralism, and that it is possible that different groups of people can be right about different conclusions, even though they have all used reasonable arguments to reach them. That is, there is no one single correct way of applying logic that brings us all to the same answer. Before you watch section 3, you need to read the Pam Christie paper, Education for an Ethical Imagination, published in Social Alternatives in 2005. There's an extra document on Wooler to help you called Crib Notes for Christie, which includes some definitions of common words in the paper that are used in ways that are different to how you might use them in everyday language. For example, the word subject doesn't mean what you think it might mean. This is to help you make sense of the paper more rapidly as you read it.